The enrollment form had been filed in error. That was the official explanation, and for approximately 3 weeks, it satisfied everyone who needed to be satisfied. The Vithara Dominion's Administrative Oversight Bureau processed thousands of interspecies academic placements every cycle, and the clerks who managed those placements were not, by institutional design, expected to question the decisions that flowed through their terminals. They were expected to stamp, file, and move on. So when a placement request arrived designating one Marin Foss, species, human, Solterran, age equivalent 19 standard cycles for enrollment at the Keithabal Institute of Predatory Excellence on the orbital station or Saval, the clerk on duty did what clerks do. She stamped it. She filed it. She moved on. The error theory collapsed on Marin's third day because no one came to correct it. Marin had already arrived by then, had already been processed through the station's intake corridors, had already been assigned a room in the lower residential block where the ceilings were 7 feet high instead of the 14-foot vaulted archways in the upper dormitories, a concession that had been made quickly and without fanfare, which told her more about the institution's capacity for improvisation than any orientation document could have. She had already eaten 2 meals in the commissary, already received her course schedule, already walked the primary training corridors twice in each direction, noting exits, noting the weight of the air, noting the way the other students moved. They moved the way things move when they have never, in the full evolutionary history of their species, needed to be afraid of what shared their environment. Keithabal was not a military academy in any sense that a human would recognize. It was older than that. It was the kind of institution that predates the concept of militaries because it was built by species that never had to invent armies. They had always simply been the most dangerous thing in whatever room they occupied. And Keithabal existed to formalize that, to refine it, to take the raw biological dominance of the Dominion's apex predator species and give it structure, philosophy, and tactical elegance. The student body was drawn from 4 species. The Vithara themselves, tall and gray-scaled, with sensory clusters along their jawlines that could detect micro-vibrations in floor materials from 40 meters. The Orcs, bipedal but low-slung, with distributed nervous systems that allowed them to continue functioning through wounds that would constitute fatal organ damage in most other known species. The Shalduran, who did not sleep in the way most species understood sleep, and whose reaction times during their rest cycles were still faster than most species at peak alertness. And the Keth, for whom the station was named. Ancient and patient, and capable of biochemical threat assessment so precise they could identify predatory intent in another organism's hormonal signature before that organism had consciously formed the intention. Into this one human, standing 5 feet 7 inches in standard measurement, carrying 49% less muscle mass than the smallest enrolled Orcs, possessing sensory equipment so limited that the station's medical officer had initially queried whether she required corrective implants before understanding that, no, this was simply the baseline. This was what humans had. These 2 eyes of ordinary resolution and these ears of ordinary range and this skin that reported pain in real time rather than filtering it, and no secondary processing nodes and nodes distributed anything. The medical officer had filed a welfare concern. It too had gone unanswered. So Marin Voss unpacked her single bag in a room designed for a species whose idea of minimal accommodations still involved reinforced wall panels, and she laid out her things with the particular economy of someone who had learned early that the space you occupy in the world should be deliberate. She put her books in a row. She set her datapad to the station's local time. She opened her course schedule and read it twice, carefully, the way she read everything, and then she sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and looked at the wall and thought, with the specific quality of thought that humans produce when they understand that the situation they are in is genuinely dangerous and that understanding changes nothing about their intention to remain in it. She had applied to Keithabal herself. She had found the enrollment pathway through a lateral section of the Dominion's academic database that was not technically restricted, but was also not technically visible unless you knew the architecture of the system, which Marin did, because understanding system architecture was something she had spent the better part of 4 years teaching herself after her first application to the Dominion Standard Xenological Research Program had been declined. Not rejected. Declined, which in Dominion administrative language meant the application had not been considered worth the processing time to formally refuse. She had read that distinction carefully, too. The research program would have given her access to Dominion archaeological sites. It would have given her publication pathways within the Dominion's academic infrastructure. It would have, eventually, given her the credibility she needed to pursue the question that had been organizing her life since she was 14 years old, when she had read a fragmentary translation of a Vethera historical text that described, in passing, a pre-Dominion extinction event that matched no record in any human database, which suggested either that the record was wrong or that something had been removed, and Marin had a strong prior toward the latter. Kethaval improbably had archive access, classified archive access, because understanding the tactical histories of pre-Dominion conflicts was considered part of the curriculum. She had found that in the prospectus documentation buried in subsection 12 of the Library Resource Appendix, she had applied the next day. She had not expected to be accepted. She had expected the application to be declined. She had planned for that. What she had not planned for was the enrollment form going through, which suggested either that someone had made a genuine mistake or that someone had seen the application and decided for reasons of their own that placing a human in Kethaval was interesting. Marin was not sure which possibility concerned her more. The first week was observation in both directions. She understood that the other students were watching her with the alert, calibrated attention of organisms for whom observation is not a social act, but a survival mechanism, and she tried to occupy that attention as neutrally as possible, which meant she walked at a consistent pace. She did not flinch at proximity. She ate her meals and attended her courses and asked reasonable questions in reasonable tones, and she made no sudden movements. Not because she was afraid of the other students exactly, but because she understood what she looked like to them. Small, soft, slow by their standards. A creature whose entire evolutionary biography had been written in an environment where the correct response to predators was to run, and who was now in a building full of things that were, in the most precise biological sense, predators, and was not running. That last part seemed to bother them more than anything else. The Vethara student who occupied the room directly above hers was named Tesh Verak, and he was the first one to approach her directly on the 6th day in the commissary, which Marin suspected was deliberate because the commissary was the most neutral territory on the station, surrounded by nutrition equipment rather than training apparatus, and approaching her there signaled conversation rather than assessment. He was 2.5 meters of scaled gray solidity, and he sat across from her without asking, which was also deliberate, because asking would have implied a social uncertainty that a Vethara of his standing was not supposed to possess, and he looked at her with the lateral sensory clusters along his jawline, doing the quiet, constant work of reading the vibrations her meal was making against the table surface. And he said, in the Dominion's trade language, that he had a question. She told him to go ahead. He asked her why she was here. It was, she recognized, not really a question about her motivations. It was a question that meant, what are you, and why are you not behaving the way the thing you are should behave? She gave him the honest answer, which was that she was here for the archives, and she wanted access to pre-Dominion conflict documentation, and this was the only pathway she had found to that access. He processed this for a moment with the particular stillness of a species that uses stillness the way humans use expression. Then he said that the archive access was restricted to students who completed the full first-term assessment sequence. She said she was aware of that. He said the first-term assessment sequence had resulted in medical interventions for 11% of students in the last 3 cycles. She said she was also aware of that. He said those were students from species physiologically suited to the curriculum. She looked at him and said that she was aware of that too. He left without further comment, but he did not look at her with dismissal when he left. He looked at her with something that had not quite resolved itself into a recognizable category, and that, Marin understood, was the beginning of something she needed to be careful about. The assessment sequence began in the third week. It was not combat. Marin wanted to be precise about that, because the popular understanding of predator species academies among humans tended to collapse into fantasies of gladiatorial violence, which was not what Kethaval was, and not what the assessments tested. The assessments tested threat response. They tested decision architecture under conditions of genuine physiological stress. They tested the speed and accuracy with which a student could process complex environmental data while their body was producing the biochemical signatures of fear, because fear was not, in Kethabal's philosophy, the enemy of performance. Fear was the medium in which performance had to occur. The question was, what you did with it. The first assessment put Marin in a sealed environmental chamber for 4 hours, with oxygen levels reduced to 83% of standard, lighting cycled to simulate 3 different threat-relevant spectra, and a series of spatial reasoning problems that had to be solved using physical apparatus that was calibrated for Bathara hand mass. She solved 9 of the 12 problems. The Orcs student who ran the same assessment solved 11. The Bathara student solved all 12 in 3 hours and requested an additional challenge. Marin's score was logged as unsatisfactory. The second assessment was endurance-based. 22 hours in a continuous low-grade stress environment involving irregular temperature cycling, acoustic interference in the ranges most disruptive to each species' primary hearing architecture, and a series of cognitive tasks that renewed every 90 minutes. Most students completed 14 to 16 hours before their performance on the cognitive tasks degraded past the acceptable threshold. The Keth student, operating on what was for his species essentially a rest cycle, completed the full 22 hours with performance degradation of 6%. Marin completed the full 22 hours with performance degradation of 11% and then sat in the debrief room waiting for her evaluator and ate a nutrient bar she had brought from her room because she had calculated that she would need approximately 400 additional calories to maintain cognitive baseline to the second half of the assessment and had planned accordingly. The evaluator, a senior Vathar instructor named Velsanith, reviewed her performance data for a long time without speaking. Then she asked how Marin had known she would need supplemental nutrition at that specific point in the assessment. Marin explained the caloric math. Velsanith asked why she had not flagged the nutritional requirement to the assessment administrators. Marin said she had assumed they would have accounted for it. Then she paused and said more precisely that she had assumed they wouldn't and had therefore accounted for it herself. Velsanith looked at her with the jaw cluster stillness. Marin's score on the second assessment was logged as unsatisfactory, but Velsanith did not close the debrief when the notation was entered. She sat with the data for another interval, and then she asked Marin a question that was not on the debrief template. She asked what Marin had thought about during the final 4 hours of the stress environment when the cognitive tasks had a 90-minute gap and there was nothing required of her except to sustain herself in an unpleasant space. Marin thought about how to answer that honestly. Then she said she had been working on a problem. Velsanith asked what problem. Marin said she had been thinking about the pre-Dominion boundary conflict referenced in the Keth Historical Codex, 3rd volume, specifically the engagement at the Palavar system, because the tactical record indicated a decisive Keth victory, but the casualty ratios in the supporting data didn't support a decisive engagement. They supported an extended attrition campaign, and she was trying to work out what the discrepancy meant, whether it was a transcription error or a deliberate revision. There was a silence in the room that had a different quality than the previous silences. Velsanith said that the Palavar records were in the restricted archive. Marin said she knew. She had accessed the non-restricted secondary sources and was extrapolating. She said the restricted archive would probably resolve it, but she hadn't been able to access it yet. Velsanath ended the debrief. She found Marin's second assessment as unsatisfactory. She also, that evening, sent a query to the archive administration requesting clarification on the conditions under which a current enrolled student might access the restricted pre-Dominion conflict files. This was noted later because Velsanath had not sent an archive query in 11 years of teaching at Kethaval, and the system flagged it as anomalous. The third assessment almost killed Marin. That was not hyperbole, and it was not the part of the story that mattered most, but it needed to be stated plainly because what came after it only made sense if the cost was understood. The third assessment was a 72-hour continuous scenario that simulated extended tactical isolation, and the physiological demands of the scenario were calibrated, as all Kethaval assessments were calibrated for the species enrolled. The calibration had not been adjusted for a human. The oversight was genuine, according to the post-incident review, though the review also noted that when the scenario administrators had queried the calibration parameters at the start of Marin's run, she had confirmed the parameters as acceptable. She had confirmed them because she had done the math on what the parameters would require of her body and had calculated that she could sustain it. She had been right about this calculation for 61 hours. In the 62nd hour, her body's ability to maintain thermoregulation under the cumulative stress load fell below a critical threshold, and she lost consciousness for approximately 4 minutes before the monitoring systems identified the event and the scenario was suspended. She regained consciousness in the station's medical bay. Velsanath was there. Teshvarak was also there, which was not a thing that had been requested or explained, and he stood at the far side of the room with his arms at his sides and his jaw clusters reading the vibrations in the floor with an intensity that suggested he was not doing it consciously. Velsanath asked her why she had confirmed the parameters. Marin said she had calculated she could sustain them. Velsanath said she had been incorrect in that calculation. Marin was quiet for a moment and then said she had been correct for 61 hours and that the error in the final interval was within the margin she had accepted as a reasonable risk when she made the decision to confirm. She said this without particular emotion, in the tone of someone reviewing a methodology for future refinement. The medical officer, Ashal Duren, who had worked at Kethaval for 30 cycles and had seen a considerable range of student responses to medical interventions, noted something in the log about Marin's affect that was not a standard diagnostic category. He described it in the log as purposeful. He seemed uncertain whether he meant it as a concern. Marin's third assessment was logged as incomplete rather than unsatisfactory. This was a distinction in Kethaval's grading architecture that had not been applied to a student in the institution's history because incomplete required a specific condition, that the student had met all performance criteria up to the point of suspension, and that the suspension had occurred due to factors external to the student's performance. The scenario administrators had argued about this for most of a day. The calibration error was the institution's error, technically. The parameters she had confirmed were incorrectly designed for her physiology. She had performed correctly against an incorrectly designed test. Incomplete. It was the only accurate notation. She asked from the medical bay when she could take the suspended portion of the assessment. There was a long silence. Velsanath said that the suspended portion would need to be recalibrated. Marin said she understood. She asked when. Teshvarak, from the far side of the room, said something in Vethra that was not translated by the room system because the room system was not calibrated for intraspecies communication. Later, when Marin asked him what he had said, he told her. He had said in the Thara, using a phrasing that had no direct trade language equivalent, but that mapped most closely to a concept of territorial acknowledgement, that she was going to complete the assessment. He had not said it as a prediction. In Vathara, the phrasing was reserved for certainties. The thing that changed after that was not dramatic. It was not a moment of revelation, not a cascade of sudden respect. It was slower than that and more uncomfortable, which was the only way things that actually matter tend to change. The students in the corridors did not suddenly defer to her or seek her company. What they did was stop walking alone when she was in the corridor, not out of fear of her precisely, out of something that did not have a clean name in any of the 4 species' primary languages, something that sat between unease and recognition, between the acknowledgement of a thing as dangerous and the acknowledgement of a thing as unknown, which for species whose entire survival history had been built on the ability to categorize unknown things accurately, was functionally the same as dangerous. She did not understand this at first. She only noticed, gradually, that there were always at least 2 other students in whatever corridor she entered, and that the 2 students were always positioned in a way that suggested they had not been traveling together before she arrived, that they had converged, quietly and without visible coordination, because something in their environmental threat processing had registered her presence and generated a response that their conscious minds were still working to categorize. She noticed this and she sat with the knowledge of it for several days before she decided what to do with it. What she decided was to continue doing exactly what she had been doing. She attended her courses. She asked precise questions. She ate her meals. She worked on the palaver problem in the gap hours of the stress assessments. She requested the calibration adjustments for the suspended 3rd assessment, and she completed the suspended portion, all 11 hours of it, in the 4th week, and she did not confirm the parameters this time without having first asked the scenario administrator to walk through the calibration math with her, line by line, in a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that the administrator would later describe to Velsanath as one of the more precise technical discussions she had ever conducted, which she said with the particular uncertainty of someone who is not sure whether they are reporting something positive. The restricted archive access came through in the 5th week. The authorization had been reviewed by 3 separate administrative bodies before it was approved, which was unusual for a single student access request and which suggested that the request had generated more institutional attention than anyone had quite intended. The access was conditional and time-limited, but it was real, and Marin sat in the archive interface room for 6 hours on the first day and found, in the 3rd hour, what she had been looking for. The palaver discrepancy was not a transcription error. It was a deliberate revision, and the documentation trail she found in the restricted files indicated that the revision had been made not to conceal a defeat, but to conceal a negotiation. The Keth had not won the boundary conflict at Palavar. They had negotiated an end to it with a species that the Dominion's subsequent historical record referred to only as the antecedents, and the terms of the negotiation included the Dominion's agreement not to document the antecedents' existence in accessible records. The antecedents were human adjacent, not human, but close enough that the physiological descriptors in the negotiation document were recognizable. Close enough that Marin sat in the archive interface room for another 2 hours after she found this and did not move and did not access any further files. When she left the archive room, Teshvarak was in the corridor outside. She did not know if he had been there the whole time or had arrived recently, and she did not ask. She walked to her room and he walked beside her, not in the coordinated convergence way of the corridor behavior she had been observing, but deliberately as a choice which was different. At the door to her room she stopped and she told him, briefly and without embellishment, what she had found. Not the full implications, just the shape of it. The fact of the revision and what the revision concealed, and what that meant about the historical record that Keithaval was using to teach the tactical philosophy of an institution that prided itself on complete threat assessment. Teshvarak was still for a long time. Then he asked what she intended to do with it. Marin said she intended to write it up accurately and submit it through the institution's academic publication process, which was the appropriate pathway for archival research findings by enrolled students. She said this with the same methodical precision she brought to caloric calculations and parameter math, and it had the same quality of something that had been decided before the question was asked. Tesh Barak said that submitting it would require review by the Administrative Oversight Bureau because the source material was restricted. He said the review process could take several cycles. He said it was possible the Bureau would decline to authorize publication. Marin said she was aware of all of that. She said she was also filing a copy of her research notes with 2 external academic archives before submitting through the institution as a standard research integrity preservation measure. She said this as if it were a routine precaution, which it was, in the sense that she had planned it long enough ago that it had become routine in her thinking. There was a silence. Tesh Barak said, in Bathara, the thing that his room's translation system rendered approximately as, "You already sent it." Marin said yes. He looked at her for a long moment, not with the jaw cluster environmental reading, with something that was anterior to that, something that was the Vathara equivalent of the thing that comes before assessment, before calculation, before threat categorization. Something that was closer to what humans would call recognition, though the Vathara had no word for recognizing something you had never seen before. He said, in trade language, this time so that it was clear and on record, "You are going to be difficult to remove from this institution." Marin said she wasn't planning on leaving before she finished her coursework. He said that was not what he meant. She said she knew that wasn't what he meant. She went into her room and the door closed and Tesh Barak stood in the corridor for a moment before he turned and walked toward the upper residential block, and the 2 students who had been in the corridor at the far end, who had converged there as they always did, now when she was in the corridor, watched him go and then looked at the closed door of her room and did not move immediately. They stood there, the 2 of them, with the specific quality of stillness that organisms use when their environmental threat processing has produced a result that their conscious categorization systems have not yet caught up with. The corridor was quiet. The station hummed its orbital hum. Somewhere in an administrative building on the Dominion's capital station, a query about a human student's archive authorization was moving through review channels toward a decision that would take weeks and accomplish very little, because the notes were already filed, the record was already distributed, and the human was still enrolled, still attending courses, still asking precise tones, still completing assessments that were not designed for her with the patient arithmetic of someone who had accepted the cost of each one before she began. The story that circulated afterward, the one that filtered through the station's residential blocks and then through the station's administrative infrastructure, and then, gradually, through the wider channels of the Dominion's academic network, was not about the archive. It was not about the assessments, or the medical incident, or the corridor behavior. The story that circulated was simply this. They had put a human in Kethaval, and now no one walked the halls alone. No one could explain this precisely when asked. The human was not threatening. She had not done anything to any other student. She had not displayed any capacity that exceeded the baseline capabilities of any enrolled species in any measurable category. The explanation that circulated most persistently, the one that seemed to satisfy people most when the alternatives were exhausted, was that the issue was not what she was capable of. The issue was that they could not determine what she was capable of, which was not a problem they had encountered before, and which their entire collective history of surviving at the apex of their respective ecologies had trained them to treat with a specific and very old response. The human did not appear to notice this, or she noticed and considered it acceptable, or she had planned for it from the beginning. The people who tried to determine which of these was true found that the distinction mattered less than they expected, and that this too was part of the problem. She was still enrolled. She was still working through the coursework. She had 3 terms remaining before the full assessment sequence was complete and archive access was unrestricted and permanent. She had calculated, presumably, what those 3 terms would cost her. She had presumably decided the cost was acceptable. The Dominion had spent a long time being the most dangerous thing in whatever room it occupied. It was adjusting to the discovery that the most dangerous thing in a room is not always the thing that is hardest to kill.